Hello guys, welcome back to LR Anime. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 Part 137 based on novel. So let's start. The final decision was for Bei Bei to take the leading role, while Shu Sanxia, Jiang Nannan, Xiao Xiao, Ji Juechen, Yi Gai, and Nan Qiuqiu would all participate. Of course, Huo Yuhao would have a spot on the team if he could pass his test. However, nobody believed that he could actually do it. Bei Bei and 4 others from Shrek 7 Monsters were part of this operation, excluding Huo Yuhao and He Kai-tu. In addition to the sword fanatic, who was also a Su sage, along with Yi Gai and Nan Qiuqiu, who were 2 soul emperors with special martial souls, their overall strength was unprecedentedly powerful. Of course, Bei Bei was very clear on the difference between having Huo Yuhao around and going on without him. Simply put, even if they encountered a titled Doluor, Huo Yuhao would give them a chance to kill their opponent with these prodigies' prowess. Without Huo Yuhao, the best they could do was protect themselves. But Dean Yang and Elder Song, who were 2 transcendent Doluor, would also participate in this expedition. Their chances were probably quite good. Bei Bei began to prepare intricately after he decided who was to participate in this expedition. He had to make sure that the Tang sect's affairs were properly settled and arranged within the shortest possible time. At the same time, he had to make a trip to Shrek Academy's Soul Tool department so that he could request Xian Lina and Qian Duoduo's support, and so that these 2 deans could help him temporarily look after the Tang sect. To that end, the Tang sect wouldn't run into any problems. Huo Yuhao didn't have any energy to see how his eldest senior brother was arranging things. His thoughts were entirely occupied by how to forge a Class 8 soul tool. There was only one set of blueprints, and he didn't get to choose. Since he didn't get to choose, then he had to rely on his own effort. Fortunately, he had He Kai-tu to help him. Even though he and He Kai-tu had conflicted with each other for a chance to participate in this expedition, they were brothers after all, and how could He Kai-tu sit by and watch when his brother was in trouble? The brothers entered one of the well-equipped silent rooms within the Soul Tool Hall. Huo Yuhao realized to his surprise that the silent room's layout was very particular and exquisite. There was an extremely large platform for crafting soul tools in the middle, and this platform's surface was silver-white, while there were all sorts of equipment and configurations around it. This seemed very similar from the one that he had used back in the Sun Moon Imperial Soul Engineering Academy, though this one was probably better. The reason was because there were some equipment and configurations that even he didn't know about. There were many metal racks and frames around the silent room. These racks weren't considered pleasing to the eye, but they were very practical, and that was because all sorts of rare metals were placed on these metal racks in all shapes and sizes. Typically, the more precious a rare metal was, the smaller the pieces on the racks would be. Forging soul tools would naturally become a lot more effective with a silent room such as this one. Huo Yuhao couldn't be bothered with admiring the Soul Tool Hall's current development as he walked briskly before the table and laid out the blueprints that Xian Ziwen had given him. Then, he started to study them closely. This was the first time that he had seen such detailed and comprehensive blueprints of a Class 8 soul tool, but this wasn't the first time that He Kai-tu had seen such blueprints. He Kai-tu's expression changed a little as he saw them. He couldn't help but utter, "Teacher Xian is cruel enough. Little junior brother, do you know what these blueprints are for?" Huo Yuhao was still looking at the rare metals that this soul tool required, but he hurriedly turned his attention towards the name on the blueprint's first page when he heard He Kai-tu's words. Huo Yuhao's expression also became extremely spectacular when he saw the name. Decomposition Cannon. The soul tool's name was just 2 simple words, but Huo Yuhao drew a cold breath. Of course he knew about decomposition cannons, and such soul tools appeared in various classes. However, decomposition cannons of the lowest class occurred as Class 6 soul tools. A decomposition cannon was a single-target offensive soul tool, and its core principles included the element of space and making use of space's pyrolytic properties to create formidable destructive power. Decomposition cannons were one of the hardest types of soul tools to forge no matter which class they were in, while they were also considered one of the strongest single-target offensive soul tools within their respective classes. That was the reason why He Kai-tu remarked that Teacher Xian was cruel. He was, indeed. Even Xian Ziwen himself would have to put in some effort if he were to forge a Class 8 decomposition cannon himself. Furthermore, Hua Yuhao could vaguely remember that Xian Ziwen had mentioned that Class 8 decomposition cannons were impractical and a waste of time. It had formidable attacking power, but forging it required too much effort, while the time and effort needed to forge such a cannon was enough to forge 3 other Class 8 soul tools. Even though these individual soul tools would have weaker attacking strengths, the 3 of them added together would still be stronger overall than a single decomposition cannon. Yet, Teacher Xian has chosen to use this decomposition cannon to stump me. Teacher Xian, oh, Teacher Xian. You are too cruel. Hua Yuhao wanted to cry, but no tears would come. But what else could he do? There was nothing he could do against Teacher Xian's authority. Hua Yuhao heaved a long sigh as he concentrated on studying those blueprints. Hua Yuhao had to make sure he knew what rare metals these blueprints required before he could gather those resources. He couldn't do anything more without sufficient materials, or everything else wouldn't matter, and he wouldn't even a chance to attempt this feat. What else was there to talk about? Fortunately, Xian Ziwen just wanted to see what Hua Yuhao could do after slacking for so long. Therefore, there were no problems with resources even though he deliberately chose a difficult Class 8 soul tool to pin him down. Shrek Academy had been receiving support from the Doluor continent's 3 native empires in secret. They didn't have that many rare metals, but they could be considered well equipped. Even though their haul couldn't compare to the Sun Moon Empire's scale, the 3 empires' combined national strengths were sufficient to support all kinds of research and soul tool production. Hua Yuhao used 1 hour to gather all the materials that he required with He Kaitu's help, and only then did he begin perusing the blueprints for forging this soul tool. His expression quickly changed after just one look. So complicated, this is just too complicated. Teacher Xian, you're asking for my life. Hua Yuhao felt like he couldn't take it anymore after going through the blueprints for a little while. 24 pieces out of 30 were for designing formation arrays. Hua Yuhao wouldn't complain if 24 formation arrays were needed, because that was just a quantitative problem. He wouldn't have any trouble with that with his speed at crafting soul tools. The problem was that these 24 pieces actually depicted just 3 formation arrays, which meant that every formation array had 8 pieces on average, and what did that mean? That meant every formation array was as complicated as one could get. Those weren't simple 2-dimensional pictures, they were all 3-dimensional, they even breached topics of 4-dimensional spatial features. For instance, the most important formation array hovered within the soul tool. This was the first time that Hua Yuhao had even heard of a formation array being used this way, not to mention ever having seen one. Hua Yuhao felt like he didn't know where to start. A Class 8 soul tool. It really is a Class 8 soul tool after all. Hua Yuhao heaved a long sigh. Does heaven want to punish me? Hua Yuhao began to scrutinize those blueprints after momentary sighs and laments. He was never one to admit defeat just like that, and he had a defiant personality that made him stronger the more suffering he took. Hua Yuhao quickly immersed himself in his studies. He wasn't hasty to attempt to forge the soul tool, but he just studied and interpreted the blueprints intently. From Hua Yuhao's perspective, forging wasn't too difficult. Forging a Class 8 soul tool shouldn't be too difficult with his current soul power. That was especially so because he had support from his formidable spiritual power. With his spiritual soul core, Hua Yuhao was confident that his spiritual power wasn't inferior even compared to a Class 9 soul engineer. The crucial problem lay in understanding this soul tool's principles and its forging method before he could get any work started. He Kaitu was still watching from one side in the beginning, but he quickly realized that Hua Yuhao had been completely absorbed into the blueprints. He Kaitu was also staring at these blueprints seriously from the side, and even though these blueprints were so complicated that he wanted to vomit blood, they were still invaluable treasures for soul engineers like them. Not every soul engineer could obtain blueprints of such top-tier soul tools, and that was especially so for the Doluor continent's 3 original empires. Top-tier soul tool blueprints were considered extremely rare. However, He Kaitu felt like he couldn't keep going anymore after observing for a short while. The Class 8 decomposition cannon's blueprints were absolutely the most complicated ones amongst the various blueprints of Class 8 soul tools that he had seen. Furthermore, they weren't just complicated. He Kai-tu felt like his head was spinning after just looking at those three-dimensional blueprints for a short while. He Kai-tu knew that he was lacking in spiritual power. Even though he was already working very hard, he knew that his spiritual power could only catch up after his soul power passed rank 85 for him to consider these blueprints. He stole a glance at Hua Yuhao, and discovered that Hua Yuhao was very seriously studying them, but he didn't seem like he was completely lost. He Kai-tu couldn't help but feel a tinge of admiration and envy. Little junior brother's spiritual power is truly admirable. Soul engineers were more reliant on spiritual power in some sense compared to soul masters, and that was more the case as soul engineers became stronger. Time continued to pass. He Kai-tu accompanied Hua Yuhao for another 2 hours inside the silent room before he left quietly, as he knew that he could no longer help him in here. He didn't know how much time would pass before Hua Yuhao would awaken from his contemplation. He Kai-tu left quietly, and informed the Tang sect's other members that nobody was to disturb Hua Yuhao. 1 day passed in the blink of an eye, and Hua Yuhao had been inside the silent room from the beginning to the end. He Kai-tu came to visit him twice discreetly, and Xian Ziwen even came to see Hua Yuhao once. However, Hua Yuhao didn't speak, and neither did he move as he stared at those blueprints, like his entire being was completely immersed within them. He Kai-tu sighed exasperatedly, while Xian Ziwen was feeling happy inside. Of course, he knew how difficult it was to forge a Class 8 decomposition cannon. This was meant to deliberately stump Hua Yuhao, after all. Xian Ziwen was clear that becoming a Class 9 soul engineer was his limit with his talents. That wasn't because his abilities at research weren't enough, but because he didn't have enough soul power. He couldn't possibly become a transcendent Doluor in the future, and if he couldn't become a transcendent Doluor, then he wouldn't have a chance to try to become a Class 10 soul engineer in the future. Therefore, even though he had become a Class 9 soul engineer, his understanding about all that was far deeper than before. That was the reason why he came to realize how important Hua Yuhao was as a prodigy, and that only Hua Yuhao could carry on his legacy and work towards breaking through and becoming a Class 10 soul engineer. Therefore, Xian Ziwen gave some deep thought about this, and decided that he had to find some way to convince Hua Yuhao no matter what, so that he would properly learn about forging soul tools from him. Under such circumstances, he needed Hua Yuhao to remain. Otherwise, wouldn't his intentions just be empty thoughts? Xian Ziwen wouldn't be surprised if Hua Yuhao couldn't complete the decomposition cannon, but he didn't wish to see Hua Yuhao not have any solutions at all. From what he could see, if Hua Yuhao could at least immerse himself within those blueprints, then he definitely would gain some understanding of them. That was enough for him. Hua Yuhao was a youngster who had just become a Class 7 soul engineer. What else could Xian Ziwen expect from him, if Hua Yuhao could understand a Class 8 decomposition cannon, which had a complexity that came close to a Class 9 soul tool? As long as Xian Ziwen could guide him, and in addition to his continuously improving cultivation, Hua Yuhao wouldn't need more than 1 or 2 years before he could become a Class 8 soul engineer. Xian Ziwen was very clear about Hua Yuhao's talents. That fellow was just too talented. Not only was he intelligent, but he also had formidable spiritual power supporting him, so he had a much easier time forging soul tools than other soul engineers. On the second day, Hua Yuhao still hadn't moved or spoken, neither had he eaten or had anything to drink. He Kai-tu was starting to get worried, and he conveyed what he saw to Bei Bei. Bei Bei personally spoke with Xian Ziwen, and he wanted to interrupt Hua Yuhao so that he could stop, but Xian Ziwen stopped him. What? Stop? What kind of joke is this? Do you know how difficult it is for a soul engineer to be so immersed in his own studies? He can only truly experience the beauty of soul tools if he is frequently immersed in them and experiencing revelations from them. Only then can he improve quickly. Not to mention 2 days, he can spend half a month not eating or drinking with that body of his without a problem. The deal has been struck anyway, you guys will wait 3 days for him. If he doesn't come to after 3 days, you guys can just leave without him. Xian Ziwen stopped Bei Bei irritably. From his perspective, Hua Yuhao was like a qualified soul engineer in his current state. He was more than eager for Hua Yuhao to continue being in such a state. Bei Bei couldn't convince Xian Ziwen, so he had no choice but to allow He Kai-tu to continue sending food and water to Hua Yuhao. But Hua Yuhao paid no attention to all that. His eyes didn't shift away from those blueprints. He Kai-tu once observed Hua Yuhao closely for a little while, as he was afraid that Hua Yuhao was in a daze from scrutinizing those blueprints, but he quickly realized that Hua Yuhao was completely fine. The reason was because Hua Yuhao's expression was changing throughout the process. Sometimes he would frown, and sometimes he would express pleasant joy. There was a time when Hua Yuhao even slammed the table with his hand, which startled He Kai-tu. It was evident that Hua Yuhao was just immersed in his own research, and there was nothing wrong with him. 2 days had gone by while Hua Yuhao was still like that. The third day quickly arrived. Bei Bei had already made all the necessary arrangements for the Tang sect. Xian Lina and Qian Duo, their 2 deans, had agreed to his request to take care of the Tang sect, and they told Bei Bei to complete his task assuredly. However, Elder Xian had also given them a time limit. Everyone had to come back within 1 month, whether or not they could rescue Tang Ya. The Tang sect needed them after all, and the Tang sect's development was related to their resistance against the Sun Moon Empire in the future. The third day is coming, and little junior brother seems like he won't be coming with us. Bei Bei said helplessly to Shu Sanxia. They were about to depart the next day, so they made some final preparations. Shu Sanxia pulled a long face and replied, I wonder why Teacher Xian is so determined this time. I'm honestly not confident at all without little junior brother around. I didn't feel that way last time, and he has always been the one planning strategies and whatnot. We're about to go onto the battlefield by ourselves this time, and I am a little lost about where to start. Bei Bei couldn't help but laugh. Seems like we have to train a little. Otherwise, won't we become laughingstocks? Shu Sanxia snapped, don't bite off more than you can chew. Who will be the main control-type soul master without Yuhao? You, or me? Or who else? Not even Sister Xian is going, and Xian can still be considered a half-control-type soul master. Seems like Xiao Xiao has to take this role, but her control only works within a small area of effect, and when the battle is spread out over a larger area, she probably can't keep everything under control. Bei Bei, why don't we look for Teacher Xian to convince him to let Yuhao go this time? He'll learn properly when he gets back. Bei Bei sighed and said, I know how important little junior brother is. However, Teacher Xian's attitude is very resolute. You know that the Tang sect couldn't have developed so quickly in recent months and years without him, and we couldn't have had so much support from the academy. Teacher Xian doesn't typically ask anything of us, so I can't reject his request this time when he is so determined. Furthermore, he usually has a casual personality, but is very stubborn when he's decided on something. I'll only infuriate him if I look for him again. Forget it, let's just work hard by ourselves. I don't think we'll have too much trouble rescuing Xiao Ya with Elder Song and Dean Yang around. I guess that's all we can do, Shu Sanxia replied exasperatedly. Alright, I'm going back. Shu Sanxia stood up as he spoke, when a voice suddenly came from outside. Done, he's done. Both Shu Sanxia and Bei Bei were momentarily stunned as He Kai-tu charged in from outside with an excited look on his face. What's done? Shu Sanxia asked confusedly. He Kai-tu said excitedly, little junior brother is done going through the blueprints, and is starting to forge the soul tool. He's asked me to look for Teacher Xian. I'm here to relay this good news before calling him. Shu Sanxia shook his head helplessly and said, Are you alright, second senior brother? Are you saying that he will succeed after he's done going through the blueprints? Won't that make becoming a Class 8 soul engineer too easy? You can go look for Teacher Xian. Yes. He might not succeed at forging the soul tool even though he's done with the blueprints. He Kai-tu forced a laugh as he slapped his forehead. I just watched little junior brother stare at blueprints for 3 days, and my thoughts went sideways that he would definitely succeed when I saw that he was finally getting down to crafting it. Bei Bei smiled and said, There's nothing sideways about that. Little junior brother might actually succeed. Isn't he very adept at creating miracles? He Kai-tu nodded and said, I also think there's hope. That's because soul engineers have to understand a soul tool's principles before forging it, and they have to figure out a soul tool's blueprints such as this one that they've never seen before. Little junior brother has been going through them for almost 3 days, and is finally getting to work. Perhaps he's doing that because he's out of time, or perhaps he has really understood them. I'm leaning towards the latter, as little junior brother never does things without thinking. Huo Yuhao had spent almost 3 days on these blueprints, and he had consumed a lot of energy doing that. How could he craft a Class 8 soul tool without his energy in perfect condition? This was his first attempt. Huo Yuhao was still meditating when Xian Ziwen, Bei Bei, Shu Sanxia, and He Kaitu slunk into the silent room, and he seemed to be deep in meditation. Everyone besides Xian Ziwen was a little stunned when they what he was like. Xian Ziwen nodded instead and said, "That's good, he still knows that he should regain his energy before making this attempt. Seems like he's very confident. Let's wait and see." Waiting around was typically very torturous. At least, that was the case for most people, but Huo Yuhao quickly gave them a reason to remove that torturous feeling, because something was happening to his body. Huo Yuhao only had faint soul power undulations before, but as time continued to pass, those undulations started to change. Furthermore, those changes were extremely weird. Faint gold colors began to emanate from inside his body. That was very normal for most people, as they would think that it was just his soul power presented externally. Most people could reach this state when they were unbridled and they didn't need anyone to protect them. However, Huo Yuhao's aura was just so dominant. A terrifying aura that resembled that of an ancient awakening beast rippled from his body as the faint golden light continued to flow out in waves. Everyone inside the silent room, including Zuajin Ziwen, began to felt a little stifled, and found it difficult to breathe. Is he using imitation when he's meditating? Xian Ziwen asked snappily. I don't think so. Bei Bei's expression became solemn. He was well aware of Huo Yuhao's abilities, and they were inside the Tang sect. How could he be using soul skills when he was meditating? But what was going on with that golden light that was emanating from his body? Huo Yuhao quickly gave his answer as fine, compact scales began to appear on his skin. These scales were diamond-shaped, and even appeared three-dimensional, as the center of every scale protruded upwards. Under such circumstances, there were many reflections off the surface of these scales, and that made the faint golden light radiating from his body even more brilliant and eye-catching. Huo Yuhao's formidable aura continued to rise, and every instance gave everyone a kind of frightening pressure. If we hadn't been so used to spending so much time with this fellow, we'd probably think he's a savage beast in human form, Shu Sanxia said admiringly. It didn't take long before Huo Yuhao's aura that resembled a savage beast finally stabilized. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief at the same time. At least they didn't have to channel soul power to resist that tremendous pressure. But their eyes quickly widened, because a strange black whirlpool gradually appeared in the middle of Huo Yuhao's eyebrows. Everyone felt their spiritual seas quiver vigorously when that whirlpool appeared, and formidable spiritual power was immediately unleashed from within it like a hurricane. Huo Yuhao's spiritual power was released for just an instant, but that instant sent everyone stumbling backwards uncontrollably. His spiritual power was released and withdrawn in a single instant, but it was released again in the next moment. I can't handle it anymore. I'll step out for a little while. Shu Sanxia turned and left the silent room with a stifled look on his face. Bei Bei and the others also walked out with strange expressions on their faces. Huo Yuhao's spiritual power was too strange, and under such circumstances, they were continuously sustaining spiritual shocks. That was more painful than being in a fight, because they couldn't fight against it either, as resisting would likely create shocks to Huo Yuhao. The only person who didn't leave was teacher Xian, who was already a Class 9 soul engineer. Xian Ziwen stared at Huo Yuhao with widened eyes, and his mouth hung slightly agape as a look of disbelief filled his eyes. What is that whirlpool? The others in the Tang sect didn't know, and that was because they weren't at that level yet, but Xian Ziwen was. Shrek Academy had wanted to express their gratitude for his contributions to the Soul Tool department, and several transcendent Doluor had personally helped him from his soul core. Even though his foundations weren't very secure, as he barely became a titled Doluor, and he could be stuck at rank 91 for his entire life, Xian Ziwen could probably spend his entire lifetime without becoming a titled Doluor otherwise with his foundations. If he couldn't do that, he couldn't become a Class 9 soul engineer. He knew how difficult it was to form a soul core because he had done it himself. Back then, he felt as if he had died, and he felt very deeply about how powerful and frightening a soul core was. But what was he looking at now? The center of Hua Yuhao's eyebrows was filled with formidable spiritual power undulations, and it seemed to release and withdraw spiritual power along with his breathing. It seemed like a soul core. But how's that possible? He's just a soul sage, so how can he have a soul core? It was very difficult for me to form my own soul core when I was breaking through to become a titled Doluor. Wouldn't he have a much harder time forming a soul core as a soul sage? But judging from the spiritual undulations that are coming from the center of his eyebrows, that is a soul core. God! Will this fellow give me a very pleasant surprise? No, that's not possible. Even if his spiritual power is strong enough, he can't possibly finish forging a Class 8 soul tool like this one. Forging soul tools requires more than just powerful soul power. A soul engineer also needs powerful soul power to support him. Otherwise, the soul engineer will find it very difficult to complete everything in one go. He also has to be able to use a Class 8 soul tool perfectly in Ardeal, and a decomposition cannon expends a lot of soul power. Xian Ziwen gradually calmed down as his thoughts stopped there. However, when he felt Hua Yuhao's spiritual undulations and felt his own undulations from his soul core, he still discovered some differences. At least, what made him more gratified was that Hua Yuhao's thing that was similar to a soul core couldn't compare to his own soul core in terms of overall strength. Then that is definitely not a soul core. Yes, doesn't he have that Eye of Destiny? Maybe this is his Eye of Destiny's unique appearance. Xian Ziwen continued to console himself. He had never heard of a titled Doluor who could establish a soul core between his eyebrows. Xian Ziwen turned and left as well. Staying in the silent room and continuously resisting Hua Yuhao's sporadically appearing spiritual power wasn't comfortable at all. Everyone was still outside when he left the room. Hua Yuhao was still meditating, so they naturally stayed back to protect their junior brother. Teacher Xian, don't you think Yuhao's aura is a little strange? Why do I not remember him having such formidable spiritual power before? Can it be that he has run into another miracle in the time he's spent outside? Shu Sanxia asked curiously. He Kai too was deep in thought as he nodded and said, yes, I don't remember his spiritual power being that powerful. Furthermore, his soul power seems to have changed. I have no idea where that aura that resembles a savage beast comes from, and the golden light radiating from his body doesn't seem to be coming from his soul power. It goes from in to out, and I don't know what's going on. Feels like he himself has turned golden. Xian Ziwen shook his head and said, I'm a soul engineer, not a soul master. You have to bring these questions to the titled Doluor in Shrek Academy. Anyway, I don't care what he's doing, and he's not leaving unless he can forge a Class 8 soul tool. Bei Bei and Shu Sanxia exchanged a helpless look. They still wanted to try to convince Xian Ziwen, but it seemed like they should dispel that thought to prevent the bitterness of being rejected. Hua Yuhao meditated for a shorter time than everyone imagined he would. 2 hours later, the soul power undulations from inside the room gradually receded, and a gentle hum that resembled a dragon's roar could be heard. This fellow. If he's done, then he's done. Why is he calling out? Shu Sanxia laughed as he chided, and he was the first back inside the silent room. However, he realized something was wrong once he came back, and that was because Hua Yuhao was still sitting there with his legs crossed and his mouth closed. The dragon hum from his body was still resonating, but that sound seemed to come from his chest. The dragon hum was faint, and it seemed to form a feedback loop with his soul power as it resonated. What's happening? Shu Sanxia turned around and glanced at Bei Bei. Bei Bei had a dragon-type martial soul, and if he didn't know, Bei Bei should know. However, Bei Bei's expression showed the same astonishment. It was evident that he couldn't understand anything that was happening with Hua Yuhao. Hua Yuhao was startled as he gradually opened his eyes. His senior brothers and sisters were all here, and even Ji Juechen, the sword maniac, was here. Ji Juechen almost wasn't in time, but Jing Xian immediately ran to call him when she witnessed the strange things happening to Hua Yuhao. Ji Juechen was very interested in and curious about any kind of special circumstances, especially when they were happening to Hua Yuhao. Therefore, he hurried over as quickly as possible. But he couldn't understand anything that was happening to him. You're all here, eldest senior brother? Hua Yuhao sprang to his feet. Hua Yuhao was completely reinvigorated, and he was in his peak condition after more than 2 hours of meditation. At his current cultivation rank, not eating for a few days wasn't a big deal. Furthermore, he possessed immense energy from the manifold mysterious ice essence, and that was enough to sustain his energy expenditure. Even if he didn't meditate, his soul power would be continuously rising, as his spiritual soul core's greatest benefit was that it helped a soul master cultivate in every instant. Xian Ziwen took a few steps forward and came before Hu Yuhao. "All right, there's not much time left, and nighttime has befallen us. If you haven't forged the decomposition cannon before daybreak, then you will stay here with me." Even though he suspected that Hu Yuhao already had his own soul core, now wasn't the time to ask him. Xian Ziwen had to wait for him to stay back before asking him. From his perspective, Hu Yuhao couldn't possibly forge a Class 8 soul tool no matter how prodigious he was. Hu Yuhao nodded and said, "You're very cruel, Teacher Xian. You didn't have to give me such a complicated one even if you want me to forge a Class 8 soul tool. This soul tool breaches knowledge about space, and you would have stumped me if I hadn't gained some understanding of spatial power in recent weeks." "What? You understand something about spatial power?" Xian Ziwen's expression was full of disregard. "Do you know what spatial power is? That's something that only titled Doluor or stronger individuals are worthy of studying. You little rascal, hurry up if you're going to it, and stop delaying. I will be watching from the beginning to the end so nobody can help you cheat." Hu Yuhao chuckled and said, "I don't need to cheat. Even though I'm not that confident, I'm still going to try. Let me warm up." He walked behind the working platform as he spoke. Hu Yuhao's expression immediately calmed down as he entered the air around the working platform, and even his aura seemed to become warm and calm. Xian Ziwen was very satisfied about that point. Even though his prized student hadn't been conducting any research into soul tools or forging them in recent months, he didn't throw away too much regarding forging soul tools. At the very least, Hu Yuhao's theory and concepts were still sound. Hu Yuhao was just standing there quietly, and he was silent for about 30 seconds as he adjusted his breathing, heart rate, soul power undulations, and even his spiritual power. He allowed every inch of his aura to enter a certain rhythm. Xian Ziwen still had a scornful look on his face in the beginning, but his expression quickly gave way to one of surprise, and that was because Hu Yuhao's current state was too similar to that of a very powerful soul engineer. Adjusting one's breathing and spiritual power are things that I've not taught him before. How did he manage to do it? Xian Ziwen was puzzled as he looked at Hu Yuhao. Right now, he was more and more interested to know how his student managed to achieve such a standard. At this moment, Hu Yuhao moved. He wasn't quick. He casually grabbed a piece of rare metal and placed it in a mold. After that, he lifted a forging hammer and started to hammer the piece of rare metal. "Is he making the outer shell first?" Xian Ziwen revealed a skeptical look on his face. For a soul engineer, the core formation should always be produced first when making a soul tool. This was because creating the outer shell of even an advanced tier soul tool wasn't very difficult. The real difficulty lay in the core formation. However, Hu Yuhao wanted to manufacture the outer shell first. What was he doing? In fact, he had thought too highly of Hu Yuhao. Hu Yuhao only chose to make the outer shell first for one reason. He was too raw. He had not seriously manufactured a soul tool for a long time. The last time he did so was during the tournament in Radiant City. Even though he had managed to understand the blueprint over the past 2 days, what if he made a mistake if he started with the core formation? He had to practice first and get used to the feeling of making a soul tool. This was what he did. A slight error when making the outer shell could be rectified. However, the core formation would become useless with even the slightest problem. He would then have to start over again, which was a waste of resources. Hu Yuhao didn't want that to happen. This was why he started with the outer shell first to get back into the feeling of making soul tools. Ding, 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 a series of crisp sounds resonated. At the start, Hu Yuhao was still rather slow. However, he gradually picked up speed. This was because the rare metal in front of him was very clear. Every minor detail on it was under his perusal. Under such a circumstance, he didn't need to think too much. In addition, he felt that he was simply too slow, given how strong his spiritual power was. This was why he naturally picked up speed. In others' eyes, he actually looked pretty quick. As he forged the metal, it sounded as if raindrops were drumming rhythmically against banana leaves. Not only was it pleasant, but Huo Yuhao's movements were also very delightful. Xian Ziwen nodded repeatedly as he watched Huo Yuhao's movements. There were generally two ways to make the outer shell of a soul tool. In one, the metal could be directly punched after creating a mold. This would allow the metal to take shape in one go. This was more applicable for larger-scale soul tools. The second way was to use Huo Yuhao's current method of forging the metal himself. It was comparatively easy to forge the metal on the carving table, since there were all sorts of equipment he could turn to. However, Huo Yuhao was so quick that Xian Ziwen couldn't achieve the same standard if he were in his place. What this required was stability and accuracy. At the same time, one's observations had to be quick. The inner parts of a piece of rare metal weren't completely stable. This was applicable across all rare metals. This was why any changes to a rare metal had to be carefully observed when it was being forged, even if it was only for an outer shell. This allowed for the most effective use of rare metals. Although Huo Yuhao was quick, he was accurate. Under his control, the lines on the metal were forged such that they were very neat. From this, it was evident how sturdy his basic foundation was. Xian Ziwen was originally very displeased with how lackluster Huo Yuhao was performing during this period of time, but this displeasure slowly faded away. No matter what, Huo Yuhao was a student that he had nurtured. Very quickly, the first piece of the outer shell was created. It was time for the second piece. With the first piece as experience, Huo Yuhao quickly adapted, and found it much easier with the second piece of the outer shell. Furthermore, the soul power undulations that he released from his body soon disappeared. Oh, this kid is using his own strength to forge the metal. Won't his muscles be sore? Sore? Huo Yuhao felt as if he had the strength of a 10,000-year soul beast even if he didn't use his soul power. Ever since he had fused with Wang Chua, his strength had grown significantly. More recently, he had even absorbed manifold mysterious ice essence and a dragon pill. With these two treasures, he felt as if he were a human savage beast. When he fully absorbed all the medicinal power of the dragon pill, he would truly become a human savage beast. Although rare metals were tough, he was already as strong as a titled Doluor. This was nothing to him. Very soon, Xian Ziwen discovered that his worries were unfounded. Piece after piece of the outer shell was created by Huo Yuhao. Furthermore, he was also getting faster and faster. Giving up the use of his soul power had no effect on him at all. Occasionally, he even lifted his head to laugh. Even still, the forging hammer still landed very accurately on the rare metals before him. A genius is a genius. Xian Ziwen raved in his heart. From Huo Yuhao, he fully understood how a spiritual-type soul master always had an edge over ordinary soul masters with regards to creating and researching soul tools. Huo Yuhao only took an hour to create the outer shell of a Class 8 decomposition cannon, which required more than 40 external accessories. Every part of the outer shell presented a beautiful streamlined design. Even with Xian Ziwen's strict standards, there were no flaws at all. After completing the outer shell, Huo Yuhao moved slightly. After that, he started to move the pieces of the soul tool on the carving table. Everyone knew that he was about to start on the core formation, which was the most important part of a soul tool. It was evident how complex the core formation of a Class 8 soul tool was. Moreover, this was Huo Yuhao's first attempt at a Class 8 soul tool. Not to even mention that Xian Ziwen wasn't confident about his chances, everyone around also didn't think that he would succeed. However, Huo Yuhao was very composed right now. His expression was very calm, and there was even a confident smile on his face. This baffled many people. They knew Huo Yuhao very well, and knew that he was great at creating miracles. This was the reason why they were willing to wait here and witness the birth of a miracle. Xian Ziwen only stood there quietly and watched. He wasn't rushing Huo Yuhao, only waiting for him to do his stuff. Huo Yuhao retrieved a piece of rare metal and focused. At the same time, he lifted his right hand and made a grabbing gesture toward that piece of rare metal. His eyes also turned dim golden. His gentle spiritual power was like a lady's hand. It landed gently on that piece of rare metal. To others, Hua Yuhao was only unleashing his spiritual power. However, Hua Yuhao could clearly sense that the piece of rare metal started to show closely woven lines. These lines were the blueprint that he remembered. Even though he had long since memorized the blueprint, he still carefully projected it on the rare metal using his spiritual power to ensure that things went smoothly. He didn't use the carving knife on the table. Each of the fingertips of his right hand now had dark gold blades at the end of them. Wasn't this his dark golden terror claws? However, he didn't fully unleash his dark golden terror claws. He only revealed an inch. In this way, he could achieve the same effects as using a carving knife. His dark golden terror claws could compare to most of the carving knives on the carving knife leaderboard. It wasn't that Hua Yuhao didn't want to use his life guardian blade. It was because his life guardian blade had grown too large. It was no longer in the shape of a carving knife. It wouldn't be very smooth using it. His 5 fingers gently tapped the rare metal before his wrist started moving. Suddenly, everyone saw a dark golden light flash before 5 slivers of rare metal slipped off the original piece. Carving using 5 blades simultaneously? He Kai-Tu opened his eyes wide. Even Xian Ziwen was stunned. Following this, Hua Yuhao's 5 fingers started to move gently and rhythmically. It was as if he were gently caressing the rare metal. Slivers continued to fall from the piece he was working on. The outer layer was soon being carved out. Hua Yuhao's actions weren't quick, but He Kai-Tu and Xian Ziwen both knew that his carving method was much faster than the traditional method of carving a core formation. The general shape of the core formation was soon carved out. However, a smile soon surfaced on Xian Ziwen's face. That's right. Hua Yuhao's actions were shocking, but pleasing. However, he realized that Hua Yuhao's actions weren't that magical. During this carving process, Hua Yuhao had only carved the outer shape of the core formation. He hadn't touched the most delicate part of it yet. He only simplified the carving process for the outside. The true essence of the core formation would depend on how well he did later on. Furthermore, this was only one of the 24 core formations required. The difficulty of creating this Class 8 Soul tool lay in how to combine 24 core formations into 3 core formations. This required all 24 formations to be completely flawless throughout the entire process. During the combination of these formations, immense soul and spiritual power was needed as support before the entire process could be completed. Hua Yuhao indeed slowed down. He retracted his other 4 fingers before using his left hand to pick up the rare metal. Only his right index finger continued to make minor carvings on the metal. Even though he was still quick, he was now much slower than before. Metal scraps continued to fall, and Hua Yuhao was extremely focused. Even though it was only the first out of 24 core formations, it was still much more complex than the central core formations of many Class 7 Soul tools. The more advanced the Soul tool, the more difficult it was to make. It was just like Soul Masters and Soul Engineers. The higher the cultivation, the more difficult it was to achieve. Xian Ziwen felt a sense of nostalgia as he watched Hua Yuhao. Then, when he was still in the Sun Moon Empire, he had relied on a Class 8 decomposition cannon to become the youngest Class 8 Soul Engineer in the illustrious Virtue Hall. At the same time, he became their chief researcher. He was really high-spirited then. It was a pity that his power was restricted in the illustrious Virtue Hall. Eventually, he was poached by Hua Yuhao, and came to the Tang sect. However, Xian Ziwen didn't regret his choice at all. Ever since he had come to the Tang sect, he had shown respect. At the same time, the Tang sect and Shrek Academy didn't skimp on providing him with all types of resources. Otherwise, how could he have become a Class 9 Soul Engineer in such a short period of time? Although Xian Ziwen knew that he wasn't inferior to anyone else in terms of soul tool research, he was also very aware that his foundation in terms of his soul power cultivation was very poor. Initially, he had relied on all sorts of medicine to become a Soul Doluor. Before he reached Class 9, he believed that anyone with 7 rings in the Tang sect could easily defeat him if he didn't use a soul tool. Normally, he was very busy with work. He didn't even have time to think about daily matters. Now that he finally had the time to rest, all types of thoughts ran through his mind. However, he was still very fixated on Hua Yuhao. Hua Yuhao was going faster and faster. From his initial unfamiliarity, he slowly regained the feeling of making a soul tool. Even he himself was delightfully surprised by that. This rare metal seemed to have been enlarged in his eyes. Even some very minor details were attended to under his meticulous observation. At the start, he didn't dare to use any carving techniques. However, as time passed, he found things much easier using his spiritual power as a guide. Very soon, his first core formation had been completed. He carefully placed it at a corner of the carving table. He then picked up his second piece of rare metal and started to carve it. Xian Ziwen took a few steps forward and silently picked up that first core formation, carefully observing it. After a brief moment, he nodded and put it back in its original position. This kid has indeed not been slacking. This was the appraisal that Xian Ziwen gave after seeing the core formation. From the fact that Hua Yuhao could create a core formation in such a short period of time, it was evident that he was a qualified Class 7 soul engineer. He was even one of the more experienced ones. Perhaps I should let him try one of the simpler Class 8 soul tools. He might successfully create them. Of course, this was only an instantaneous thought in Xian Ziwen's mind. Hua Yuhao was already getting faster and faster. The creation of the second core formation took only 4/5 of the time he needed to make the first core formation. All 24 core formations were being built for the same goal. There were 3 groups of 8, and each group had their own similarities. Furthermore, they were also interlinked in some aspects. Hua Yuhao took 2 hours to finish the first group of core formations. The 8 formations were neatly arranged on the table. Xian Ziwen revealed a weird expression on his face when he saw this. He could still clearly remember that he had taken a total of 6 days to finish creating a Class 8 decomposition cannon when he was still a Class 8 soul engineer. As for the first group of core formations, it had taken him 3 days. It was the same core formations. The first group was the most difficult. It was only at the later stages that one could proceed faster as he grasped the technique. This kid has actually succeeded. At least it doesn't seem like he's made a mistake. It'll be even easier later on. Surely he hasn't made a mistake, has he? Xian Ziwen wanted to remind Hua Yuhao that he could take a break halfway into making an advanced soul tool to recharge. However, when he looked at Hua Yuhao, he immediately discovered that Hua Yuhao was very energetic. He didn't seem the least bit tired at all. He doesn't need to rest then. Xian Ziwen thought to himself wickedly. He turned around and walked out. He found that it was already dark outside. From the sky, it seemed like it was 6 hours to daybreak. If he can't finish before daybreak, it won't count even if he succeeds in the end. Furthermore, so what if he succeeds? If it can't be used, he'll still lose. Even Xian Ziwen didn't realize that his mentality had already changed. At the start, he had believed that Hua Yuhao was destined to fail. Right now, he was already starting to think of ways to keep Hua Yuhao behind. The change wasn't gradual. Hua Yuhao naturally didn't know what Xian Ziwen was thinking. He was completely invested right now. It was indeed much easier to complete the second group compared to the first group. However, he wasn't complacent at all. This was because he knew that any flaws could result in total failure. This was a Class 8 soul tool. He needed to pour in soul power to link the components. If there were problems with the internal structure of the core formations, the entire formation would be disabled. When that happened, his efforts would be futile, and he would have wasted precious rare metals too. That was something he didn't hope to see. One by one, as Hua Yuhao did his work, he was also counting. As time passed, he felt that his movements were getting more and more fluid. I've seemed to become better from not practicing. Teacher Xian should be rather astonished. However, this thought only flashed across his mind before disappearing. This was because he almost made a mistake from being this slightly distracted. In fact, his improvement from a lack of practice was an anomaly. As for the reason, it was because his cultivation had risen too quickly. Using his immense spiritual power as support and his originally sturdy foundation, He managed to remain error-free as he had immersed himself in the research of soul tools over the past few days. No matter how complex the core formations of a Class 8 soul tool were, they were still core formations. What was needed was only more effort, soul power, and experience. Huo Yuhao definitely sorely lacked experience. However, he had an advantage in the other aspects. The soul power of a soul master with twin martial souls was greater than most other soul masters of the same tier. Right now, Huo Yuhao's soul power had only reached rank 80, but he had the soul power of an ordinary rank 85 soul Doluo. This also meant that his actual cultivation wasn't too far from a titled Doluo. After all, he already had a soul core. The second group was completed. Huo Yuhao let out a long breath. After he finished his second group of core formations, he finally lifted his head and stretched his neck to relax. "What time is it, eldest senior?" Huo Yuhao asked Bei Bei. Bei Bei replied, "It's only 4 more hours to daybreak." "All right." Huo Yuhao responded before he got to work once again. The rest had already returned to rest. Only Bei Bei, Ji Juechen, Shen Ziwen, and He Kai-tu remained in the room. It was normal for He Kai-tu and Shen Ziwen to remain behind. However, Ji Juechen caught everyone by surprise by staying as well. He didn't say anything either, and only stood where he was like a target board. He silently observed Huo Yuhao. There were undulations in his eyes, as if he were thinking of something. The others didn't disturb him. This sword fanatic had a different mindset from ordinary people. However, his cultivation speed didn't lag compared to those from Shrek's 7 monsters. Right now, he was sparring less and less with the others. However, there was an obvious improvement every time he did so. In addition, he had identified one opponent, and kept going to that opponent. This relieved the pressure on many others. This person that he had identified was Shu Sanxia. Ever since Shu Sanxia gained the Xuanwu shield and fused with the Golden Tortoise, his abilities were on the rise. He had even beaten Ji Juechen. In addition, his defense was so strong that he was unafraid against Ji Juechen. In the Tang sect, Ji Juechen was known for having the strongest defense, while Shu Sanxia had the strongest defense. It was only right for the two of them to spar. Shu Sanxia avoided Ji Juechen, as he didn't want him to find him. Huo Yuhao only took 1 hour to finish the second group of core formations. However, he slowed down on the third group. This was because the third group of core formations was the most complex. The requirements for precision were also much greater. There was one formation that was in the center of the entire formation. This formation was the smallest, but the most complex. It was only the size of a cherry, but the patterns that had to be carved on it were very complex. There were easily 2 or 3 times more patterns in this one than there were in the others. Huo Yuhao first completed the 7 other formations in the third group before he started on this most complex formation. He was very careful, and slowed himself down. The golden lights in his eyes were much brighter than before. This was because he was afraid of making even the slightest error. Shen Ziwen silently watched at one side. He had a look of admiration by now. He didn't know what to say about this student in front of him. This video will end here.